Genade, genade, we kunnen er toch over praten, luiden de laatste woorden van Theo van Gogh. Hoe kunnen we zijn smeekbeden als opdracht lezen? Hoe hou je het gesprek gaande in een land dat met elkaar lijkt uitgepraat? Nu, 20 jaar later, gaan grote denkers en makers hierover met elkaar in gesprek. We kunnen er toch over praten.
Welcome at the Balie. Welcome at the Vrijdenkersfestival. My name is Trojan. I'm program editor here at the Balie, and I'm really happy I'm going to host this event today. I just looked up the name Thomas Chatterton Williams in my email to tell you how many times I tried to invite him. And then I found an email of my colleague. She sent it to me in 2020 with a Guardian interview. And only one link to it, to the Guardian interview. Is it time to unlearn race? Thomas Chatterton Williams says yes. The author and critic discusses why we should move away from race categories defined using plantation logic and suggests retiring from race. The email of my colleague was titled, "What do you think?" I was not really sure what to think, but I was really curious and I really wanted to have this conversation about it. So since 2020, I started inviting Thomas Chatterton Williams. And sorry, I'm going to say, at first he never answered my emails. So this spring I got a little bit desperate, and I asked Stefan Sanders, who had a really interesting interview with him at the Groene Amsterdammer. What can I do to make Thomas Chatterton Williams come to the Balie? And he said, just keep on inviting him, because I also sent him 8 emails before he said yes to do an interview with me. So with new hope, I wrote a new invitation, and he said yes, finally. So he's here today to have this conversation about race. And I'm also really happy that Sunny Bergman and Ikenna Azuke are here today, and Stefan Sanders to join this conversation we're going to have today. So before I give the floor to Thomas, let me introduce him to you. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of Losing My Cool and Self-Portrait in Black and White. He's a visiting professor of humanities and senior fellow at Bard College. Born in New Jersey and now living in Paris. A warm welcome to Thomas Chatterton Williams.
We have a saying in America, the 20th time is the charm. So it's really nice to be here. I was just walking around, the center of the city thinking what an extraordinarily pleasant place this is to live, and how do more people not just want to pick up and move here. It's so nice to be here, and much sunnier than in Paris. I'm just going to read very briefly from my second book, Self-Portrait in Black and White, which is a very personal book, but it also is making an argument through personal experiences against racial categorization. And so I'm just going to read a bit about what I mean by racial categorization. People will always look different from each other in ways we can't control. What we can control is what we allow ourselves to make of those differences. The idea of racial categorization is an old one, but it is not an ancient one. We know that the Roman playwright Terence observed, "I am human, therefore nothing human is alien to me." And we know that imperial Rome was a dizzyingly cosmopolitan milieu, men and women speaking all manner of tongues, worshiping all manner of gods, displaying all manner of skin tones, moving through it. And yet it's worth lingering a moment longer on the fact that Terence did not proclaim, as he might have, "I am Roman, therefore nothing Roman is alien to me." It has become a commonplace to acknowledge the following point, but it bears repeating anyway. The idea of distinct human races, as we understand it today, only stretches back to Enlightenment Europe, which is to say to the 18th century. I have stayed in inns in Germany and eaten at taverns in Spain that have been continuously operating longer than this calamitous thought. With the publication of Systema Naturae in 1735, Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist and father of modern taxonomy, fatefully split mankind into 4 color-coded strands: Eurapus, Americanus, Asiaticus, Africanus. Later, the German naturalist, father of anthropology and coiner of that confused and confusing term Caucasian, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, would have us be 5. The aforementioned Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American, which was red. Though to his credit, he de-emphasized hierarchical thinking. The divisions have always been somewhat arbitrary and imprecise, and have fluctuated many times since. What these scientists were attempting, however inadequately, was simply to describe the real physical differences that they observed in the world around them. In Sweden and Germany, such pursuits were fundamentally abstract. The social and political significance of race and what we've come to understand as white supremacy, how it came to be lived on the ground, was something only fully being realized in the collision en masse of these different-looking peoples in the New World through conquest and slavery. This is also why, to this day, many Africans who remained in Africa have never thought of themselves as black. It was in the New World that race, and more important, racism, emerged from a fundamental imbalance in power among social groups, as the historian Jacqueline Jones observes in A Dreadful Deceit. On slave ships transporting men, women, and children from their homelands to the New World, European captors became white, and their African captives became black. Over time, these 2 adjectives took on multiple meanings, with white signifying someone free and descended from free forebears, and black signifying someone enslaved and descended from slaves. The social and political, as opposed to scientific, significance of the binary is obvious in the maddeningly whimsical nature of one colonial law, which first declared the legal and therefore racial status of mixed-race children to be transmitted via the father, only to be subsequently reversed to the mother. Before tradition took hold, these were distinctions set in wet cement and not in stone. Yet the color hierarchy that emerged from this lopsided, centuries-long encounter, even in the absence of slavery and subsequent legalized oppression, has proven extraordinarily resilient and highly transferable, as capable of global scale as sugar and cotton production, though it has never found a more rigid logic than in the United States of America. I was reminded of this fact one sunny autumn day in Berlin, where I lived far out on the city's western edge. Across the placid Lake Wannsee stood a stately Italianate summer villa that once belonged to a Jewish industrialist before it was stolen by the Nazis, whose leadership infamously gathered there over a 90-minute lunch to settle upon their final solution. The House of the Wannsee Conference now functions as a museum, a sobering testament to the boundless monstrosity that can arise from the desire to sort and bind people into racial categories. The walls inside are plastered with images that make the blood at turns boil, then freeze. Grainy photographs of pogroms and massacres and jaunty propaganda, which in the far-right Alternative für Deutschland party has begun to recycle today, urging the people to create full-blooded German babies for the greater good. Excuse me. I visited the house with my college best friend, my daughter's godfather, Josh, himself a descendant of Eastern European Jews. We drifted through the rooms at different speeds, and soon I found myself facing a large illustrated display detailing the Nuremberg laws, which were of course concerned first and foremost with measuring Jewish descent, but they also, and even more stringently, sought to codify who would count as black. The Nazis were famously inspired by the practices of Southern whites, and it shows. The first anti-miscegenation statute in the United States, which affected marriage, dates all the way back to 1661 in Maryland. It didn't prohibit marriage between whites and blacks, but it did enslave white women who married black men. I studied those mixture tables, the ominous circles marked Deutsch, you guys are going to forgive me for my bad German, Deutsch, Blutiger, Mischling, and Jude, that were shaded with pseudo-precision to varying degrees. I lingered over their insanely meticulous rationale. Then one excerpt in particular caught my eye. Pursuant to Article 6 of the first supplementary decree of the law for the protection of German blood, marriage should be prohibited if it is likely to result in offspring that would taint the purity of German blood. This decree prohibits marriage between persons of German blood and those of foreign blood, even if they are not carriers of Jewish blood. Negro blood is so strong that its influence is frequently still clearly visible among members of the 7th or 8th generation. In cases where the intended spouse carries Negro blood, a particularly thorough examination will therefore be required, the results of which will determine whether the marriage is permissible." End quote. It was wildly unnerving, even all these decades removed, suddenly to feel that Nazi gaze, however brief and distracted it may have been, channeling the hatred of the Southern slaver and turning itself on me. Because of the codifications the Third Reich so militantly tried to impose, since the Second World War, in academia and the mainstream media, and respectable discourse throughout the world more generally, such racially essentialist ways of speaking about identity have been overwhelmingly discredited, which is, of course, all to the good. Now we prefer to rely on euphemistic terms such as culture, ethnicity, nationality, ancestry, and if we're being more current, genetic pools, to make sense of the inevitable human variety. And yet, beneath this enlightened veneer of politesse and scientific rigor, when we resort to received habits of speech, uncritically describing ourselves and others with abstractions like black and white and half-black, or when we discuss approvingly or not the presence in our backgrounds of Jewish or Native American blood, is the underlying logic really all that evolved? Or is it possible that there has been left over some ideological residue from the Nazis, from the Southern planters before them, or going further back still from the Spanish, who created the first limpieza de sangre laws to separate old Christians from those who carried Muslim and Jewish taint? My goal here is to refute, however difficult that may prove to be, such persistent and flattening thinking that has led to so much human suffering, precluded and squandered so much human potential. To do so, whiteness, the disastrous illusion undergirding all aspects of race, will have to be overcome. Yet I am also aware that the proud and resilient identities that have formed in reaction to its construction may be, in some ways, even harder to convert. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you always saw yourself as black, and then your daughter was born. What happened?
It's interesting to be here too today because I've seen some children and other people walking around who look like family members of mine. So, you know, one of the things about growing up, what's called black in America, descendant of slaves, is that as long as there have been quote-unquote black people in America, there have been black people with blonde hair, blue eyes, and white skin, many of whom had been enslaved, many of whom had been unacknowledged children of slave owners. So, you know, black people have always had a very elastic understanding of what a black person looks like. And
in America.
Yeah, and legally, I think in certain southern states like Louisiana, someone was legally black and therefore enslavable at 1/32nd descent, which is, you can look like the Queen of England and be less than, be more African descended than 1/32nd. So, you know, it was really a kind of obsession over a drop of black blood making a person black, and that was the law that was used to enslave, but it also became a kind of cultural point of pride and solidarity. And I grew up, you know, I was born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s. It wasn't until the year 2000 that in America the census allowed you to check more than one box. So you didn't have a multiracial category until...
When do you have to cut... when do you have to...
On the every so many years, 4 years or so, or 10 years, there's a census. They collect demographic data.
Okay.
And you you define your own race, and you used to have to choose one, so you couldn't choose white and black. So, as Barack Obama and many black people who were born before the turn of the century did, and as I did, you just choose the black box. That a drop of black blood makes you black, and you don't think about it. Even in a legal sense, you don't think about it. It wasn't even, there wasn't this idea that it was so strange to be black but to have a white mom. It was actually it was a kind of solidarity that I felt very proud to participate in, and there's a lot of beauty in that type of inclusiveness. And so I never really thought, here I am, I have a white mom, I'm, light-skinned, clearly mixed, but I was a black man and I didn't think very hard about it. And the white kids I grew up around didn't think I was white, and the black kids were accustomed to having friends who were all manner of appearance. So I just assumed lazily and without thinking very much that, I'd have a child and she or he would have a drop of black blood, and therefore they'd be just as black as Lenny Kravitz or something, and and I wouldn't think very hard about it. I didn't think very hard about it. I just accepted the habits of thought that my culture gave me without thinking for myself what it actually means until I started to live in Paris. I moved to Paris, and I was married to a woman who, it didn't really dawn on me, looked exactly like my mom in terms of blonde hair, blue eyes. And I heard myself at times explain to French people like why my kids would be black or why I'm black. And just not seeing them immediately click with understanding they didn't inherit the idea of the one-drop rule that I grew up with.
Before they were born, you already had discussions about your children being black.
Yeah, or just they would ask me, what's my origins? Or that's what French people say, what are your origins? And I would say, well, I'm black. And they'd say, but they wouldn't just immediately respond the way Americans do. And I just heard myself over the course of years making this kind of argument for the one-drop rule that sounded normal to me in America, but more and more in Europe didn't quite make sense. And then I had my daughter was born, and I realized, I don't believe in this fiction anymore. I don't know what it means to have a daughter who's supposed to be a different race than my dad. I don't think these categories are describing any of us very well. And then I started to suspect they might not be describing anybody very well. And what would it mean to actually say, I know that my personal decision doesn't necessarily change the world, but I'm no longer participating in the logic of the slave plantation just because that's what a few slaveholders decided would be the way they'd organize the society I was born in.
And how does that look like, not participating?
I mean, people always, there's an idea of there's several critiques that I always get. So you're just going to close your eyes to racism? Well, no, I think racism is quite real, but it doesn't require that race be a biological reality for there to be racial prejudice or racism. So it doesn't mean that I don't pay attention to racism and the way people are treated differently based on how they appear. Also, I think travel does really help. I had an epiphany at some point in my 20s when I kept getting, racially profiled during, the War on Terror years, and then the 2015 when there were all these ISIS attacks in Paris. In airports and things, I could be racially profiled and treated unequally as a Muslim, as a North African, which is the way people with some of my physical features tend to be categorized in France. But that didn't make me Muslim or Arab. It just was, it had nothing to do with who I am, but you can be treated a way based on the kind of ideas that circulate in your society. So that kind of divorced my understanding of racism from race even further, or racism. Racism or prejudice can be a fact, but it doesn't make the things that it says you are real.
So now you're retired from race.
Yeah, and so I'm sorry. That's one more thing. So the other critique is that people say, well, I don't want to give up the culture that I feel an affinity for. But I don't think that just recognizing that these categories are actually quite fluid, that they are a choice, and that they are not rooted in significant biological differences that can't be explained by anything other than, population pools. Like, to give up on that does not mean that I don't still like a certain type of music or greet a friend from where I grew up with a certain type of handshake that signals a kind of belonging in a certain type of culture. I think you can have the culture that and the things that we take so much pride in with identity without reifying the very dangerous idea that these categories are fixed and cannot be transcended.
And is it possible to say I am ex-black and then not use words as black and white? Or
it's really hard. It's hard to. You can't even write a book about it without using the words. I have a foreword in the book about how I'm trying to be very intentional with the way I use words to not, because our habits of language just reproduce the very habits of seeing and racializing that if you want to critique, it's very difficult to name the thing without talking about it. It's hard in regular life to talk about these things without resorting to the terms that we use for shorthand, but I try to be very intentional, self-critical. I try to use more precise language than resort to labels.
Can you give an example of that, precise language?
Yeah, so if you said, if someone says, what are you? If I'm in France, I would say, well, on my father's side, I'm descended from, Africans who were enslaved in the American South, mostly in Texas for a couple hundred years, and on my mom's side, mostly German and English immigrants, who some ended up in, Maryland, some ended up in Massachusetts. I mean, it takes longer, but
more words.
It does. But isn't that we all are people that are more specific than these labels? What does it mean to say somebody from Ghana, somebody from Alabama, somebody from Brixton? They're all just black, and this Albanian guy over here, this Jewish guy, this Russian, and King Charles, they're all just white. I mean, it's weird when we have this monolithic color category that flattens all specificity. So I try to, I really try to be mindful that way while realizing you can't give everybody a dissertation on your identity. So identity is always, that's the thing, identity is always a negotiation between me, how I see myself, how I want to define myself, and you, who has a certain amount of time to meet me and to make up your mind about me as an interlocutor, but also the institutions I interact with. I choose not to identify myself anymore on official forms, but I can only do what the forms actually allow me to do too. So it's always a negotiation, and there are certain things I can't just decide. I can't just say I'm Japanese or a squirrel or something like that. There's a limit to how I can negotiate my identity, but I have more agency and autonomy, I think, than a lot of us have been told we have. I can reject some of the terms of this negotiation, and I want to do that more and more.
Okay, thank you. I want to invite Stefan Sanders, columnist, presenter, essayist, and writer. He has published essays, travel stories, a novel, and memoirs, and there's a weekly column in NRC Handelsblad. Welcome.
Welkom allemaal, and especially Thomas, since it's it's wonderful that you're here. Let's put it that way. Let me get some water. Almost a year ago, on December the 3rd, 2023, Thomas Chatterton Williams, is there a name that's nicer to pronounce? Thomas Chatterton Williams. Thomas Chatterton Williams and I were walking gloomily through the streets of the 9th arrondissement in Paris. Our gloom was on a grand macro and geopolitical scale. Marine Le Pen could very well become the next French president. Biden was old and uncertain. We heard far too little from Kamala Harris. And what if Putin kept pushing in Ukraine and Trump became Biden's successor? ... We let those hyphens toddle out in front of us as we walked through that elegant street close to Williams' home. Yet, the following summer of 2024 also became the summer of Harris' comeback, now as a presidential candidate. Still, it was Trump who held both the American and global stages in his grip with his unique hot and cold baths, a method once applied to only those labeled mentally ill, now applied to the entire American population, the world population. That summer, Thomas and I did not share our gloom, for we didn't see each other. And now, nearly a year later, just before the American elections, while we meet again here in the city of Amsterdam, my own city, Trump threat levels feels more alarming than ever. We could fall into an even deeper despair now, feeling powerless as we wait for a catastrophe to unfold. Now I think is the moment to explain why I always see a glimmer of hope when Thomas Chatterton Williams appears. Despite our shared mixed ethnic backgrounds, he's a very different man from me. He's the father of two, he's an American, born and raised as African American with basketball, hip-hop, naturally black American gestures and black American raps, all things that don't come naturally to me. He is, that's very important, 20 years younger. He still has time to be very, very, very promising, and so on and so forth. But here's where we meet. Our intention to step out of the prison of racial politics, to quote two great American writers, Albert Murray and Stanley Crouch. Much more than I was born in Haarlem, Noord-Holland, unfortunately not Harlem, New York. Williams grew up with the so-called certainty that one drop of black blood makes someone and their kin black. That it's evident what being black entails and what it should mean, and that race politics, is an excellent basis for the eternal struggle for emancipation. Williams has since moved far from this idea. For example, in his book, he just read out a self-portrait in black and white. Everybody secretly knows that the concept of race is a 19th century fiction. Yet we continue dividing the world into black and white, and oh yes, into people of color. That is the vast majority of the world's population, who remain as a term born out of embarrassment, nearly an afterthought. Stop doing that, especially those who identify as black or people of color, says Williams, says I. And that's even more courageous for someone as Williams, who has so deeply experienced the American reality. We tell ourselves a story about ourselves, that's one. And two, society has stories ready for us, about us. As a homosexual, I learned to distrust that old societal narrative about illness, weakness of will, and spinal deformity, about contagion and situational homosexuality. Gay man and lesbian kept shouting against society for so long now that we are part of the LGBTQIAPC+, how did it in once, community, and the two letters being pansexual and cisgender. All those different genders and sexualities, try finding the one true identity among them. You can even discuss this. the homosexual has been dissolved in the alphabet soup, just as Freud has said that the superego dissolves in alcohol. But when it comes to color and ethnicity, there are only two options: black, white, and okay, people of color, in the jargon of the local police chief. And these limited identities are set in stone. They must never, ever be tampered with. Everything those prison guards, the supervisors of society, invented about black and white is not only believed by the prisoners, they even promote it with unprecedented enthusiasm, as if they themselves invented it. They are proud of it. They argue about it, who the only true authentic black person is. Meanwhile, the prison guards are standing by, grinning dismissively. Old Murray, the great American essayist who embodied nearly a century of American experience, he was born in 1916 and died in 2013, wrote, "Any fool can see that white people are not really white and that black people are not black. It's a fiction intended to protect that other, much larger fiction, whiteness, pure whiteness. Let's not be the handmaidens of these dangerous and life-destroying fictions. Without these race-based fictions, the world is already dangerous enough as it is, or as it may become." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan Sanders. So first reaction on the column of Stefan Sanders. Still feeling gloomy and...
No, actually, it's so heartwarming, not just because he was so kind to me, but it's so heartwarming to think that you can think something, feel something, write it while you're sitting alone in one part of the world, and it really means something, or somehow it communicates something to somebody sitting somewhere else in the world, and they, what you just read, I mean, they understand exactly what you're thinking better than even a lot of people that are physically close to you wherever you are, and that's the power of communicating ideas, and then maybe realizing that there are other people around that you can form, I don't want to say form movements with, but that you can join in solidarity with, and you can forge a community through writing. Just on that level, it's really powerfully moving to me. On the level of prose, I mean, God, he's writing in English and sounding like James Baldwin, so there's a nice rhythm to it.
A lot of compliments. Let's invite two other people on stage to join this conversation. Sunny Bergman and Ikenna Asuike. Dutch documentary maker, writer and activist Sunny Bergman, whose work critically examines identity, race and gender. For example, in the documentaries Zwart als Roet, My Colonial Hangover, about Black Pete, and Wit is ook een kleur, the color white, about white privilege. Her last book, Mijn Nazi-opa, explores intergenerational trauma.
My
Welcome.
Nazi grandfather. Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Another story topic. Ikenna Asuike is a Nigerian British broadcaster living in the Netherlands. He began his career as a lawyer and is now a journalist, presenter and filmmaker. His documentary series, The Afro-Europeaan, from the VPRO, is currently airing on NPO. Welcome also to you.
Thanks.
So what were your first thoughts on the book, Self-Portrait in Black and White? Ladies first.
Okay. Well, I really liked the honesty in it, and therefore also the vulnerability. You were saying some things that I hadn't written doubts and ideas that you had. So I felt like I was in dialogue with you. So I was really, and obviously also because I knew I was going to be speaking to you. So I kept talking back. So like, I agree with this. No, I don't agree with this. But what about this? So that's like, I was grateful to Rogaya for asking me to participate, because it was nice to be intellectually challenged. And it's something, a topic I've been thinking about a lot as well, coming from the, like, being considered white and researching whiteness. So it was very interesting.
And Ikenna, your first thoughts?
Similar to Sunny, really. I found it courageous, vulnerable, confrontational. I found myself also reading certain bits, because the documentary that I've made has actually been about embracing my blackness. So it was almost the reverse to the process that you've been through. So I was quite like adversarial as I was reading it. I was like, no, I don't want to agree with that. But then at the same time, the last documentary I made was called The Post-Racist Planet. And I hope that we can achieve that situation. And this idea, I think it's inventive, and I want to be open-minded to it as well. So, thought-provoking.
So maybe start with a clip from Afro-Europeaan.
Kuka ymmärtäisi mua parhaiten? Tai sille kumpaa kulttuuriin mä kuulun?
Ikenna Azuike werd naar de beste privéscholen gestuurd, studeerde rechten en verhuisde naar een Nederlands dorp.
Hey. When I go back in Nigeria, I don't know the ins and outs of the culture. And back here in Britain, I'm also an outsider.
I tell a lot of people, my brain is in London. But my heart is still right there.
Why you don't say our community, you say your community?
Porque no fundo nós é tudo família.
The strong African communities of God. None of us get to be who we are and where we are without history.
Feel at home.
It's like, you don't understand, you are so Somali. I brought them up to be part of the world.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So it's a beautiful documentary series, and also an intense search, intense journey about your identity. How was it?
Yeah,
still
difficult.
Fresh.
Yeah, definitely still fresh. It's kind of life-changing, transformative in how I think about myself. And working through some traumas as well. What became clear was, I think I had struggled with my identity for a long time, moving from Nigeria to the UK, age 8. I was very focused on assimilating into the culture and kind of hiding in plain sight. I was one of only 2 black boys, as you can see, in a lot of the schools that I went to. So I share a very painful memory for me about my dad, who's a dark-skinned black man, Nigerian man, and I didn't want him to come to my school sports day, one of my first schools, because I was basically embarrassed that he would blow my cover. It's a dark-skinned black man, and everyone would then know. And to talk about that in the open is very difficult, like to own that, because you feel immediately judged and feels uncomfortable. And through the series, there were several people that I spoke to who made me feel more comfortable in my own skin, in my identity as a Nigerian. For a long time, I felt like a fake Nigerian, a fraud, for many reasons. Like, I don't speak my dad's own language. I didn't have any plans to move to Nigeria anytime soon. But thankfully, I'm now able to embrace my Nigerianness. I realize we come in all shapes and sizes, and there is an Ikenna shape and size. And about my black identity as well. I think I've been searching for belonging, for a community. And that is extremely, yeah, it's deep, it's emotional, and I think in contrast to you, I didn't really grow up with that community around me. So I still think this is part of my process, and I don't know if I'll end up where you are. I don't know if it'll be the other way, but I feel so seen, and the responses I get from the series, other people have struggled with the same things, and if there's one critique about your book, it was very cerebral, and sometimes I felt like, there's so much there's so much like joy, and you talk about that as well, like celebrating culture, but I feel so warm now that I feel more comfortable embracing a Black identity, and that's powerful, and I don't feel ready to give that up anytime soon.
How do you listen to that?
I mean, it's interesting because I could respond to that, or I'd like to potentially talk about what it means when everybody embraces their identity and feels community, because I think there's a very dark side of that I'm guessing, in Germany was the superlative iteration of thinking that we belong to a collective and that matters more than commonality, right? So maybe before I answer, we should talk about what it means when a kind of white identity, solidarity,
yeah, but there's a difference. I think when you're talking about marginalized groups, it's of course a very emancipatory process to embrace a community, just like it is with the LGBTQI+. You don't have like straight people go, well, there's some dumb people saying like, let's celebrate Straight Day or something, but that's always a reactionary response.
Koningsdag.
Huh? Koningsdag. Oh yeah, I guess. Queen's Day is King's Day is a day we...
Holiday.
Yeah,
here.
Well, Dutch people like to get very drunk and dress up in orange. But I think you can't really equate those two, can you? Like white people embracing their white identity, it's always quite like a racist tendency to it.
It's always tricky to speak across cultures, but in America we're having a huge problem right now because we've had a longer time probably of every group that's not white feeling what I really understand Ikenna was describing and celebrating their commonalities, and it's reached a point of backlash that's become quite toxic in our culture and politics, where a lot of white people said, I'm tired of actually being guilty about being white. I'm tired of everybody else having their history should be celebrated, their sexuality should be celebrated, and I'm to either be quiet or I'm to actually reflect on my privilege and potentially apologize and give up my spot at work. It's actually, I'm not even talking about whether that's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is now
a backlash,
breaking our society. And it made me think quite a lot about identity politics. Feels good. It's certainly a weapon that can be picked up by anybody. When white people who are majorities in these societies are mobilized around the idea of identity being salient in their conception of what matters, it's not usually good for non-white people. And I think we're all served in kind of thinking what matters most about us is not our particular identity divisions, but the commonalities. I don't think it's realistic to think that it can last indefinitely, that only one group doesn't celebrate or rally around its identity. And so I really understand that. I even understand why it's not the same, of course, as you're saying, but I also think it's not workable. And I'm more convinced of that now than when I wrote the book, watching what's happening with the election and seeing people more freely speak. Elon Musk, most famously, is probably a white identitarian who's saying, I like being white, why am I feeling bad about this? Like, celebrate, it goes in dark places.
Yeah, but Ikenna, do you think it's possible to still celebrate blackness and at the same time that it has nothing to do with celebrating whiteness? Or
yeah, I was going to say, I mean, why can't we have both? Why can't we get to a point where we can celebrate black culture and also the commonalities between all of us? I think part of me worries a little bit about if you play it out, like, what's the consequence? race fluidity entirely. I feel like there's a lot that could potentially be lost. Because you talked about how you de-blacking, as it were, does not prevent you celebrating your black culture, black culture. I don't, but for your daughter, that will be different. And so play it out for us.
Well, I think that people have different levels of comfort with, think of themselves as, it's a term that is a little, I don't mean it in a pretentious sense, but cosmopolitanism feels more or less comfortable to different people. Not everybody has the same comfort. Like, I think, when I think of what I identify with or what matters to me, I do think of, like, essays by James Baldwin, which I think are black, in quotes. It's a perspective that comes from a kind of people that was in America, and he's a genius example of that. But I also don't think I've ever identified with a book more than with The Brothers Karamazov, which was written by a white racist in Russia who hated Jews 200 years before I was born.
Why did you identify with it?
Because on the level of the
fiction?
human, I think that there are things that we identify with, and that there are places where we are reachable that are not the way that that can't be broken down into color categories or gender categories and things like that. I think there's a universal human culture I participate in. I feel extremely Jewish, having spent a lot of time living in New York City, and New York City is a culture that is Black, Latino, Jewish, and Chinese, and those cultures, I think, I mean this literally, those cultures have shaped me in certain profound ways, and so I'm kind of comfortable.
So you want to celebrate cultures, but not identities.
But they don't all mean the same to me.
Without saying the word black or white.
Well, no, I don't even think you could. I mean, I want to get to a point where we don't actually believe that we do this double game, most of us do, where on one level we say, the most contemporary science says that race is not biologically meaningful, but it's a social construct, and that's really important, and it defines the way that we are in society, and we can't actually transcend that. So we say it's not real at the same time that we slip back in the door and say it must be preserved. As Stefan was saying, we're actually like, the prison guards are just like, it's up and running, we can go watch the game. They're keeping themselves imprisoned.
But you also can say that it is real because that's the way people are seeing
exactly.
you.
But that never changes. You know, it's like money. We all say that this piece of paper is worth $50, so it is. But it's possible. It's physically possible to decide it's not. And it's physically possible. Race is not, if it's not biologically real, we could do things otherwise. And that, I guess I'm not so naive as to think everybody will or wants to, but I think a lot of us don't even question that it could be otherwise. And that's why the book that really changed my thinking on this was Racecraft by Barbara and Karen Fields. It came out in 2012. And these two black scholars made the pretty powerful argument that race in modern society functions like witchcraft functioned in Europe in the Middle Ages, or in parts of Africa and Asia today, or in Massachusetts in the colonies, that there's no such thing as being a witch, but in a society that believes in witchcraft, you can be killed for being a witch. And there's no such thing as human beings, Homo sapiens, being split into different races, but we make that a real distinction. And I just want to push back and say that it's a long way of answering your question, but I am more comfortable saying that, you know, that identity is fluid, and there are many things I identify with. I have French children now, and that has actually changed me. I've become, in a way, through them, something that I wasn't born. And so I think that these things can be participated in and valued without us making that next step where the category becomes the most important thing and guarding the walls of the category. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but that is often what I see as the dark side of an overemphasis on identity.
You also have a blonde-haired, or kind of daughter. How did you also have an identity crisis like Thomas?
No, I think what I had with Suki was kind of a crisis of fatherhood, as it were, because I had this kind of Hollywood picture of what it would be like to be a father, and at the time I didn't have that, so I didn't have that emotional connection like immediately, and that was quite troubling for me. But it took a few months until I developed that emotional connection, and now, you know, yeah, obviously it's there in spades, but it didn't trigger any kind of identity crisis for me. Obviously, I would get on the streets, you know, people say, "Is that your daughter?" And Dutch people can be quite direct and not hold back about questioning that. So that was annoying, but I don't know. At the time, no, it didn't do anything.
Well, I want to watch another clip from a documentary you made, The Post-Racist Planet.
Yeah.
Let's start watching, and here are the subs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dit is mijn vrouw Mette en mijn kinderen Suki en Kobe. Net als veel ouders vinden Mette en ik het moeilijk om over racisme te praten met onze kinderen.
What do the people look like?
Of ons.
And what do we look like, Kobe?
Bruin.
Bruin? Is Suki bruin?
Yep.
What color is Suki then?
Wit. Nou, ik ben niet helemaal wit hoor. Ik ben niet zo wit.
And what about mama? What color is mama?
White, die is groen.
Mijn kinderen zien dus ook kleur. Maar hoe moeten we het gesprek verder met ze voeren om bij te dragen aan een wereld zonder racisme? Hoe pak je dat aan?
Kijk, het liefst wil je het gewoon niet benoemen, maar ik heb geleerd dat dat juist helemaal niet goed is. Of dat het niet werkt, want de wereld is zoals die is. Dus ik denk wel dat je het moet gaan uitleggen dat het er nou eenmaal is. Dat racisme er eenmaal is. Je moet ook op een gegeven moment beslissen van wat ga je erover vertellen.
Maar ja.
Ja.
Ik denk gewoon beetje bij beetje.
Ja.
Droppen into the conversation. Op een kindvriendelijke manier. Kleur bestaat. Tja, en ik heb meteen de neiging om precies te zeggen wat mijn vader zei tegen mij. Gewoon, jongen, je moet echt harder werken dan andere mensen. 2 keer zo hard. En eigenlijk heb ik de neiging nu om dat tegen dat donkere jongetje te zeggen.
Ja, dat moet je niet doen.
Het is zo'n belasting voor iemand, vooral op zo'n jonge leeftijd.
Ja.
Oh. Sweet. Sunny, you also did a lot of research on racism. What do you think? How should you talk about color?
Well, what I've learned, because we did for our film researching whiteness, we did the black doll, white doll experiment, which you probably know, with a lot of kids between 4 and 6 in the Netherlands, and we found that kids do see color and that it's very organized through white supremacists, through the lens of white supremacy. So most kids would say the white doll was more intelligent and the black doll was dumb and needed punishment. So that was very a clip that was very eye-opening for a lot of people. And what was interesting was that the parents were watching their children doing this. So we filmed the parents' reaction as well. And most parents were very shocked, obviously. And because I got the children through, like actually Rogaya worked on that film as well. And we got the children through asking on Facebook. So most of the parents were followers of my work and were like claimed to be very left wing. So they were like, wow, why are my children saying these things? Like, I don't teach them racism. So what we found was that children absorb what's in the culture. And then when you look at how to counter this kind of brainwashing, is to talk to children about it. And I have one example that, like, I've done a lot of workshops on this, and like one of my children, who's also of like, well, mixed descent, and he came home one day when he was like 4, and he said, "Why are all the kids in my class who are of Moroccan descent, why do they live in high-rise buildings? And why do all the white kids live in more expensive homes?" And that was a way for me to talk about the history and how people, the migrants from Morocco, came here, and what the history was behind it. And then later, when he was around 11, he started questioning textbooks on slavery. And I actually interviewed him for my film on whiteness, when he said, like, we were taught that the enslaved people, like, that was very recently in the textbooks, like, that they were actually naughty for standing up to the plantation owners. Like, they were he showed me pictures in the book, and he was critiquing. So I was proud. I was like, yeah, he learns to think critically about what is portrayed and how race is portrayed. So I think you can talk with children from a young age. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
That's okay.
I think you can talk with children. Children are not so fragile. Like, when you use their curiosity, you can engage and especially talk about history and how, like, power structures, that power structures don't come out of thin air.
How do you, sorry,
Yeah.
how
Go
do you
ahead.
do that with your daughter then, especially?
Oh, we talk about, I mean, she's got a much more sophisticated understanding of race than I did growing up. She's 11. Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said. I don't think that what Martin Luther King Jr. or anybody who truly understands colorblindness means is that you can close your eyes to structural inequality or power imbalances or histories of oppression. I think actually you have to know your history quite well and to know why society is organized the way it is to actually know that it is not biological and that it is not because people are born into inferior, superior groups.
What words do you use if you
so-
talk to your children? What's an example
Gosh.
of this? How do you have this conversation?
I should say we must have had the same dad, because my dad also just said to me every day, "Well, son, the fact is you're just going to have to work harder." But that's what my black dad from the segregated South said every day. But I tell my kids, like my daughter, I was saying this just recently, there's so many incentives for children that look like his daughter and my daughter or my son to just meld into whiteness. They're invited every day to just be white and not think in a more complicated way about what they are. People are happy to, to not complicate a blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid's life with questions of mixing. So I've always just spoken to my daughter, very honestly about her grandfather, my father's experiences. I mean, my father's old enough to be my grandfather. He was 27 years old before the Civil Rights Act passed, so 27 years of his life into adulthood, he was a second-class citizen in America. And I think she has a very pretty concrete grasp of what that means in real terms, of why her French grandfather inherited intergenerational wealth and why I pay my parents' mortgage. She understands that that's inflected with color, with histories of color, but she is also aware that she sees herself in my dad's facial features. So she's also aware that it's not blood and skin, that it's the way the society he grew up in was organized that penalized characteristics that he had and ancestry that he had. She actually can do that in a way I couldn't when I was 11. So I think you can really have these conversations with kids. I do know, I felt so bad when my kids came home and they had those types of, I remember the first time when I was a young parent, a friend saying that he was horrified because he was on the bus with his son, who himself was even mixed with Asian and white, who was 4 years old or 5 years old and pointed to some Arab and black kids standing at the back of the bus and said, "Look, Dad, some thieves." And my friend was like, what? And he didn't, that's, there's a moment where you realize your kid has picked something up that you don't know where they got it. And kids don't start out that way, though.
It reminds me of my children reading like Suske and Wiske, well, anyway, cartoons. And then when they saw the bad guy, like that was always kind of a piratey figure, and they would say, Papa! Like they would say, Daddy! Like,
oh, wow.
Because, yeah, their father has a big black beard, like looks kind of Arab. So big black beard, or what people would consider Arab, or I don't know, whatever, like racially... but they would think that was their dad, the bad guy.
But they don't start this way. There is a moment where, like, I remember this very much with my daughter. You would ask her about her day and who she was with, and she'd be like, the girl with the pink shoes, that's my best friend. Yeah. And then you realize that's the only black girl in school, but the only thing that she knows was she's wearing pink shoes. And there's a moment where she realizes that's the black girl.
Yeah.
But she doesn't come into the world noticing that, or thinking skin is the most important feature. That is learned, and it's very early and it's very sad, but that I have to believe can be unlearned.
What was the answer you found on that question yourself?
Sorry, which particular question?
The question: how do we have to talk about? Do we have to talk about race with our kids?
Absolutely, like both of these guys, we absolutely have to have a conversation, and we.
Ik zou zo meteen even wachten, doe zo meteen maar.
We also surround ourselves with the right tools to be able to have that conversation. So books with black leading characters, role models around us, having conversations about my own roots with my kids, and they will still make occasionally the mistake to refer to Africa as a country, for instance, and then Suki. Yes, I know that 54 countries. Yeah, so 54. The correction, but then in a playful way, and yeah, like that. But what's I don't know, what sometimes worries me is that even with with parents who are very aware about the need for us to have these conversations, and I've also had that moment with my little boy cycling through Bar and seeing an older black man and saying, hey, he's poor, huh? He's poor. And I was like, what the fuck? What? We need to stop the bike. We're going to have a conversation again. I don't know if we're going to accelerate progress by de-blacking and kind of hoping for the fluid race fluid world that might help us achieve the post-racist planet. Yeah. I don't know if we're going to accelerate by de-blacking.
Yeah.
Can I say one thing? I think actually, what would change that is if black people weren't disproportionately poor in the societies. I think that actually solving inequality that overlaps, race is classed and class is raced, if you can actually make a more equal society where people meet each other as equals, where it doesn't so happen that the kid says that guy's probably poor because statistically he's more like, then I think you could actually have a better chance at getting the post-racial society. That's why I think a lot of this stuff actually does come down to what kind of progress can we make materially with the gross class inequality that often reinforces racial prejudices.
But as soon as you take away the black racial identity, I fear that can be weaponized by people who want to keep power balances the way that they are.
Sure.
One of the things I was wondering, because like the blurb on the front of your book, he's I don't know the guy, but I looked him up. He's like a conservative thinker. So when I was reading your book as well, I was
Douglas Murray.
Yeah.
Well, that's the English. That's the British version of the book.
Yeah.
But I think my publisher tried to get the biggest writer they could get to blurb in England.
The biggest conservative writer.
But that's my worry, that these kind of conversations are taken out of context by right-wing thinkers that say, okay, let's stop talking about racism because race doesn't exist, because a black guy says so. Like, just
that
really
happens for sure.
simplified.
That does happen for sure.
Yeah, and that's... it's like je gooit het kind weg met het badwater. Like
English translation.
The baby out with the bathwater. The baby out with the bathwater.
No, that certainly happens. I don't know. I think I used to think about that more than I do now. I remember very distinctly, I was profiling a guy in the UK who had been an Islamist, and he became an anti-extremist activist. And I said, you know, your critiques of Islamism, they do get picked up by people who hate Muslims and, you know, like the British far right. What do you make of that? And he said, I make of that, like, what's the validity of my critiques of Islamism? And I can't control who uses it. I just try to, like, as clearly as possible, say what I believe is true. And you really can't control, if you get into the point, and if you get into the custom of kind of anticipating what a malevolent actor, and I'm not saying Douglas actually, he's a very conservative guy, but he's a nice guy. If you get into thinking about how somebody can misuse your points, and
then you can't think freely anymore.
Then you can't, exactly.
No,
exactly.
And that's what I really admire in this book, because to be honest, there were conversations in here that I've had with my fellow activists and people. Well, I feel like now I can't say black anymore, but black friends. But that we would have these conversations in private. Like there's one example in the book whereby you admit that you're meeting this important black writer from America, and you notice within yourself that you're embarrassed to bring your white wife there. Like these are things that are difficult to...
And then what happens?
Yeah, the denouement is even more interesting. Then I show up without my ex-wife, and he's standing there with his white wife, and he's like, "Hi, nice to meet you."
Yeah.
And I'm like...
No, but I mean, these are of course, and I understand that you do not want to think about how your free thinking can be misused.
Right.
That's the freedom that you're looking for, and I totally understand. So that was, but I didn't understand why you would choose a conservative guy to promote your book.
Actually, that your foreign publisher chooses that stuff. But Douglas, I mean, he's a huge best-selling author, but he's also a very smart guy. Yeah. I don't actually fully agree with his politics.
But I want to watch another video clip, one from the documentary Wit is ook een kleur, The Color White, also from the VPRO. Do you want to say something about it? Or
no, let's just watch it.
Let's watch.
Hoe is het eigenlijk om wit te zijn?
Om?
Wit te zijn.
Wit?
Ja.
Nou, dan kan je beter aan hem vragen. En aan hem. Dan doe je blank.
Ja, wit.
Prima, maar het voelt niet anders dan wanneer ik zwart zou zijn, denk ik.
Wat doe je met wit?
Als etniciteit.
Oh, wat is wit? Dat is een hele gevaarlijke opmerking. Potentieel dan... Vindt u ergens dat ik daar niks op zeg?
Nee?
Ja.
Hebben jullie het gevoel dat de witte mensen goed integreren in Nederland?
Witte mensen?
Ja.
Ik vind het ook een moeilijke vraag. Ja. Ik vind het gewoon überhaupt een rare vraag of zo.
Je vraag is, kunnen witte mensen goed in Nederland integreren? Ja.
Witte mensen. Dikke mensen. Witte mensen. Goed integreren.
Ja.
Maar hoezo moeten wij integreren? Witte mensen hoeven dan niet te integreren in Nederland.
Ik zoek wel een donkere man.
Dat dan weer wel.
Licht donker, beige. Met zwart geld. Met zwart geld. Wie mooie kinderen kan maken, dat dan wel. Maar daar houdt het dan wel mee op.
Okay.
Wow. That's also Amsterdam.
Yeah. This is actually the start of the film. Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Thanks.
I mean, it's a very difficult question for white people to answer.
Apparently,
Yeah. No, the idea was that white people don't never think about being white. So that's why, like, we were looking for a way to start the film, and then I was like, isn't it weird that in Amsterdam, that's so multicultural, there's white people going to their white hockey club and white this and that, and they just move in a very wide circle, and have they ever thought about it? Because there's research that showed that out of all the ethnic groups in Amsterdam, white people are the least integrated with other cultural groups. So then this was actually around the corner from where we work, and it's like a place where people go swimming, and there was only white people there. So I thought, like, did I realize it's weird that there's only white people here? So it's always fun to ask what people think are very strange questions.
It's really interesting to see how physically uncomfortable their reactions are.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and the guy who just said, no,
do you mind if I don't answer?
Exactly. He didn't want to answer at all.
No.
So there is obviously the recognition that, it is, white people feel like they're walking on eggshells, the discomfort around conversations.
Yeah, well, this is out of 2016, so a lot of debate on white privilege wasn't more commonplace than it is now. But what I discovered, like, because I was part of, I started being part of an anti-racist, the anti-racism movement in the Netherlands, because we have this very racist figure here. It's called, I don't know if you heard about
Wilders?
No, yeah, yes.
also.
Yes.
Another one?
Him as well, yes. That's kind of funny. Like, all people in power at the moment are very racist. But anyway, Black Pete. It's a guy
I know
who's black-faced. Anyway, so we started. There's been a lot of protest against this, and I joined this movement, and then I made a film about it. And I learned a lot about what is called whiteness as well, because I jumped into it and, of course, started researching. And one of the main defining features of what I discovered of whiteness was that people do not consider themselves an ethnicity, or do not think they're the standard of neutrality, that, like, they can be objective and other people can't. And that's of course a cultural thing. Not like, I mean, I totally agree with you that there's nothing essentialist about it, but it's how we've been programmed. And I think that's one of the things I was thinking reading your book. I feel like when you're teaching white people about this, like, there's like an evolution. Like, first, all white people were extremely racist. Then they started saying, no, I don't see race, we're colorblind. And then they learn about white privilege, and they think, oh, actually, maybe I have been programmed to be racist or believe in white supremacy. Let's unlearn that. And that's where, I'm on that process, because once you start being aware of this, you can unlearn what you've been taught. And then, like, what you're describing is, like, the next phase.
Exactly. I have that discussion in the book. Actually.
Yeah, but most of society isn't there yet. Like, they're still stuck either on their I'm colorblind, or like Geert Wilders, like the first stage, and then there's people who are now trying to decolonize themselves. So
I think white people have a slightly more complicated movement to make if they were to, especially like in places, I guess Holland is similar, but in America certainly, like the way that my mother grew up, she wasn't even vaguely aware of like what her European heritage would be. She was like a blonde woman from Southern California, like she's just white. There's no like, I'm German and Hungarian. It was just, I'm just white. And that's neutral and visible. And other people had race or ethnicity. And so like, for a lot of well-meaning white people, you have to actually begin to think of yourself as racialized in society. Not that your race is real or whiteness is real, but that society also racializes you, not just everybody who's a deviation from that norm. And then you have to, I think, do the next step, which is not what the actual white supremacists and racists want. They want you to get out of that colorblind area and racialize. That's actually what they speak very openly about. Is like they don't like that white people think of themselves as neutral either. They want white people to have a strong racial identity. But so you have to get people to have that kind of understanding of themselves as racialized, and then to reject holding on to that racial identity, which is another movement, and that's not where non-whites are. They already know they're racialized, so they don't have to learn that.
Yeah, so we're behind.
So you have to racialize white people, or get them conscious of being racialized without making them become race fetishists or white supremacists. And actually, in America, there have been very kind of paradoxical situations at very fancy private schools where they do racial affinity groups, and they say, you know, I'm talking about schools that cost...
racial affinity groups?
So they would separate the class and say, mixed race black guys over here, full black guys over here, Chinese, Asian kids over here, Jews over here. White people sit over there and reflect on your privilege. And like every other group would say like blacks are great, like we have like Michael Jordan's black, and the Chinese kids would say like, you know, we're like great engineers, and you know, and the white kids would say the first couple of meetings they would say they would reflect on their privilege, and by the end they became a white supremacist group, like 8-year-olds, and they said like I don't want to like feel ashamed of who I am. I want to be white people are really powerful. We conquered the world, and you know.
But what was the reason why they were doing that?
Everybody became heightenedly aware of group differences. And the white kids had not thought of themselves as a group. They thought of themselves as neutral. So there is a danger in making people have to think of themselves as racialized in society, but then have the appropriate tools. And I know that's how you do with your work, but there has to be that next step to then reject falling into that kind of, well, let's just stop at the praising our identity differences stage. You know?
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I mean, I'm learning a hell of a lot, and it's just, I don't know. Like I said before, it was so personal, the documentary I just made, and so traumatic. Like all the memories I was going through, and I now am at a point where I'm embracing my blackness, and then. You know,
then I invite you for this
exactly
conversation.
But I don't know where to place the discomfort. If the discomfort I had was more to do with just but I do have all these different identities in myself, and it is fluid, or whether it was like shame about my blackness. I don't know. I'm just in a process of it, basically.
That sounds like the best answer you can have.
Yeah. Before I go to the audience, there's one topic I want to discuss. I called it interpersonal relationships. In the book, there's a story about the grandmother of your children, Genevieve.
That's the alias in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell it?
Oh,
and the racist
artifact.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is the...
Genevieve and the racist artifact.
Grandmother by marriage of my children's mother. So she is in her late 90s now. You know, this is a woman who extremely French, you know, in the way that I think... people in your documentary would think of being French, you know, like she's French from the roots, as they say. And, you know, her family was bourgeois, and the Nazis took their country home and occupied it. And, you know, they actually suffered some hardship during the wars. Family members were killed in World War II fighting, you know, the Nazis. And she grew up in most of the 20th century, during which France was still a colonial power, and I think very easily had things like what I noticed in her house in Normandy was like, it's called a tête de nègre, like a head of a Negro on her coffee table, that just like you open the head up and there's like candies and stuff. And, you know, like I just like caught a glimpse of it once, and like, you know, my children's mother and her cousins who are my age, like they're mortified by it. They're just like, you know, Parisians who think that's like crazy that their grandmother has like, you know, a slave head on her coffee table, and they would always hide it. But once you couldn't hide it, you couldn't move it while she's standing there, because she'd be like, "What are you doing?" So, you know, I was just thinking, this is so obviously a racist artifact, and I wouldn't want like my child to see that, and you know, to think that that's normal. And I felt myself getting more and more angry about it as I'm thinking about how I wrote it in the book. It was very true at the time. I was like, it bothered me. But I felt as I was arguing with my children's mother, Valentine, about what it meant, at some point I felt like I was performing an anger too, because the fact of our interaction was that I was always treated with dignity and respect. My black father was a guest in the house, and there was no interpersonal animosity or racism. It was a way of being in the world that I don't think she was aware hurt me. I think if I actually told her, like, that is wild, I think she would, like, even, like, be really surprised, and it's like...
You never told her?
No, I mean, she's like 97 years old, and it's like, is my job as a descendant of African slaves in America to perpetually educate every last old white person that grew up with a way of seeing the world that I think is outmoded and rooted in prejudice? Or, like, is what matters actually that I materially meet her granddaughter on equal terms, she materially and interpersonally treats me and my family on equal terms, and she still has residues of ideas and ways of thinking that are actually literally dying out in certain cases? And is that enough for me? And I kind of thought about it, and I was like, I also don't feel that fragile. I feel kind of fine. So, like, I just said, I don't like that. I think that's kind of racist. And I'm, like, big enough to just go about my day. And so I kind of spent some time in the book reflecting on how important are some of these things. I think it's wrong, but I also think, you know, lots of stuff is wrong. And, like, what matters is that I'm actually, like, living the life I want to be living.
Yeah.
And raising my children the way I want to be raising them. Yeah. And I'm not here to be a teacher, a moral teacher to everybody.
Yeah, and you were like, the only decision that I can make is don't let it harm me.
Yeah, I think so. I think you have to also, as a non-white person, I think you have to also say that I am not just a perpetual open wound that can always be harmed. You know, I'm actually, I can choose to have a thick skin. And that's not to be like a victim or to just let her get away with it. It's to say that, like, life is short, I've got a lot going on, like, that doesn't matter. Like, every microaggression doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, but I think there'll be a lot of people who hear that and just think it's a very privileged position to take when you're in living in a project and you're a dark-skinned black man, black woman. You don't have the option to...
That's right. I agree. I think that is actually my point. I think that some of this stuff will get more and more sorted if we can figure out how people can live more and more on equal terms. I met her as an equal. She wasn't supporting me. I didn't need anything from her. I'm at least as educated as her. So I think if we could have an equal society, some of that would be better than people living in projects also feeling the weight of microaggressions that are compounded by material inequality.
Yeah, but Ikenna, how do you look at that? And do you think it's something we should pursue, not be harmed by microaggressions like that?
I think it's important to speak up.
Also to a 97-year-old? Or
yeah, what is it? I wonder what it means to teach someone.
My grandmother, when I was having it, she's also like 97, when we were having a debate about Zwarte Piet, I also felt like, am I really going to...
Just going to give up.
Well, I just left it because she was 97. I think you could...
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously like... you know, there are limits, perhaps, to this, but what I recognize, to keep it personal for myself, there have been too many situations where, because of my tendency to be a pleaser, I have not spoken up. Yeah. And I've always, put people who are unapologetically black and speak up and outspoken and on such a pedestal. And
and you remember those instances when you don't speak up. Yes,
yeah, absolutely, and they're painful. And now I'm making so much more of a conscious effort to speak up and find a way. I mean, it doesn't have to be the adversarial. You know, what are you doing with this fucking head on the table?
The anthropology,
suitable ways to have conversations.
Sinan Chankaya had coined the term micro-revolutions as a reaction to microaggressions, and in that book I wrote about my grandfather being a Nazi, which is a different story. Anyway, I write about my father because my father was very actually an example of someone who didn't understand the term white privilege, because he comes from a very, very poor background. So he just felt like, what the fuck are you talking about? I never had any privilege. But one time I had to give a lecture, and the host, I wanted to shake his hand when I was leaving, so I said goodbye, and he said, "Oh, but please, can't I have a little kiss?" And I was recoiling inside because it was so sexist and
crazy.
Yeah. Anyway, so I didn't speak up because I just wanted to leave. I was like, oh, that's so ew. And I did give him a kiss. And then he wanted to shake my father's hand. And my father was like,
that's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, and that was like the perfect example of a micro revolution because my father just put him in his place and without doing anything.
Yep. Beautiful.
And this guy very awkwardly had to kiss my father.
Amazing.
Yeah. Okay, are there any questions from the audience? Okay, wait.
Yeah, my question is, so what I was thinking was you were talking about identities. And I feel like the discussion about identity and other forms of identity. And what I'm thinking is, if we're in a supposedly free society, can rediscover themselves, learn about themselves, and identify as man or woman, or perhaps non-binary or something else, right? If people have that freedom, somehow I don't understand that if that is an option, individuals, children are not allowed to think, read a book, and tell their family, well, Dad, I've been thinking about it, I'm not black. So my question is, why do you think there is this incredible tendency to impose identities on children and others?
Great question. Very dangerous question, actually. Like, in America, there's quite a lot of resistance to analogizing questions of gender with questions of race, but it's extremely rational, I think, on your part to ask the question, why is it that we police racial identities and ethnic identities, but we don't, or we're moving into a world where an individual is allowed to freely choose things that also have biological components to them. I think it's actually there in nature. I think, you know, to allow people to freely choose racial identity would show that it actually is something that is extremely fluid and not set, and that you would have to admit that this is not an actual category, natural category. So I think it's policed so hard because it's so easy to lose. You can change a family's entire complexion, physical characteristics in a generation or two. Literally, this is what was tried in Brazil when they brought European immigrants to try to lighten the population that they felt was too black. You can quickly change racial phenotypes. So I think that really is at the heart of why it's so policed. And in America, it was policed for the reason that I touched on, which is that it really had implications about whether or not you were free.
Okay.
So what I'm thinking, right, listening to you, if I think of it at a small scale of, say, a family or a group or a community, what liberal attitude that says, oh, okay, I understand. You're saying that you're black, right? As far as I'm concerned, you're an African American, but I understand what you say. So people have, it's as if people have this idea that if they self-identify as a thing, that is what they are, and the entire world has to unconditionally acknowledge that, rather than the idea, to them, I'm black. I identify as African American. To them, I'm Pan-African. So I don't understand why it's so rigid and static. I mean, like, skinheads can call me Negro all day. I won't identify as a Negro, but I know that skinheads identify me as such.
I agree. That's what I meant by you negotiate your identity, but you define yourself.
Okay.
I really agree with you.
Okay.
But are there limits? Sorry, I mean, you made a joke earlier about self-identifying as a squirrel.
Right.
I mean, do you have to put guardrails around this, or how does it work?
I think it's what you can. I think is what you can do where you are at the time you exist. So I already have quite more fluidity and freedom in the way that I'm allowed to self-define, even though my dad knew when he was growing up that he didn't believe that there were distinct races of Homo sapiens, but he was very aware that was not something. He didn't have much freedom in self-definition in Texas in the 1950s. So I think it also matters. Context is, yeah, there are limits, but I think that people make we make steps towards greater and greater freedom, and I think I can speak in America. It is more free today than it ever had been, even in my childhood. So.
Okay.
Somewhat related to the previous question, I think. There may not be one master button to switch off to get out of this discourse of black and white, right? Because words have a very different power in different situations or contexts. And you've discussed now the context of education, interpersonal relationships, cultural heritage, but what about a major context of representation? So politically black, political blackness as a necessary means perhaps to get the unity, in order to state your claims and get ahead. So how about that? And how does your view of being ex-black or relate to post-blackness? This movement of artists in the United States about, well, precisely about representations and different ways of representing black.
It's a great question. I really think I've really become more clear on this since 2020 or so, or since 2013, 14, and the rise of Black Lives Matter. I think that representation can matter. I think you have to be very realistic about what numerical majorities and minorities actually mean in terms of power. And I think when I look at something like Black Lives Matter, black people in America, it's a large group, 44 million people or something like that, but it's only 13% of the American population. It's never going to be a big segment of American society. When we saw all these videotaped killings of black men dying...
and women?
And some women, for sure, of black citizens dying at the hands of police and vigilantes, there was a movement that organized around the idea that black lives also matter. I really understand that. I really understand representation. We need to draw attention to the fact that this disproportionately happens to black people. It got some sympathy, and then it generated it generated a backlash. A backlash happened, in fact. I'm not defending the backlash, but it's a fact that a backlash happened and people lost sympathy at some point. I have become convinced it would be much more. It would be on much more solid ground to base claims in universal human rights and universal rights of citizenship that all people, all Americans should be scandalized that this black person was killed because we don't want to live in a society where police break and kill people.
So what would be the slogan?
American Lives Matter? That's a bit scary as well.
I think we have to organize on values that everybody can lastingly buy into, as opposed to...
That's maybe a difficult slogan.
It might be a difficult slogan, but Black Lives Matter backfired as a slogan eventually. It started off hot, and then it actually became something that organized opposition to it. So these are complicated questions, but I think...
Yeah, but doesn't that always happen with every revolution?
The civil rights movement is the best example I can put. They were very consciously grounding everything in the universal rights. And that's why every other movement has used the civil rights movement, the gay liberation movement, women's liberation. Every movement has based its claim. And the most successful recent movement, gay marriage, also based the claim on we are deserving of rights that everybody is deserving of. These are not rights for us as a bloc. And in my experience, I really think that's the way that some of these these ideas of progress can stick. If you just say police shouldn't be killing black people, that's not going to be enough. And it hasn't been enough. It's really not been enough. It's actually even been the opposite.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so the two of us, we're biting our tongues here. There are so many aspects that we would like to add to the conversation. So my name is Leontien Vreken, born and raised in the Netherlands, Vlissingen, rural area, province, Southwest. My mom is black, my father was white. I grew up in a black family thinking that I'm a bounty because I'm so white in my preferences, my friends, the music that I listen to. And I'm listening to the conversation here, and I'm thinking, aren't you really talking about being ex-black and embracing your identity as a person with all the different facets that you have? And you are embracing your Nigerian heritage, actually, saying, yeah, I'm embracing my blackness, but aren't you actually embracing your cultural heritage? You know, I identify as a double blood, the book that she has written, Etchikafoon. Double blood meaning, you know, I'm half Dutch, half Surinamese. I identify as being bicultural. I also ask people, I do not ask them, where do you come from? I ask black and white people, what's your cultural heritage? Because the difference between somebody who was born and raised in Amsterdam is huge compared to somebody who was born and raised in Limburg, Maastricht. You know, they don't celebrate Carnival in Amsterdam. So I would like to add that to the conversation. Aren't we actually talking about accepting yourself for being a human being rather than I'm accepting myself as being black or I'm identifying as ex-black?
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good point. Amma.
Yeah, I just thank you all very much, and thank you also for another double-blooded person. We'll have a conference later, but I wanted to add a little. I want to offer something. So the concept black. I was not black until I turned 13 and moved to the Netherlands. Before that, I was half-caste Ghanaian Dutch person, which has all sorts of
white,
other or white.
Or
I was
Chinese.
also white. I was also white, and for 2 seconds I was Chinese. But
can you please tell the story about the Chinese?
Okay. Well, Amma, do you want to? Okay, me and Amma were walking around on the market in Ghana, and of course. Not of course, but Amma speaks anyway. So she can hear everything that everyone was saying about us. And at one point she said to me, those women from that market stall just said, look at those 2 Chinese sisters over there.
So, but you know, I think that's an important, because it's a perception, right? How you are, I think you were raising that, how you are seen in the world. The first thing I wanted to offer as I'm listening to you is why black? Why? Because I was not black. And maybe why black is because of what was lost, what was broken. And it was a conscious effort to try to unite and empower something. And that's why black, right? As in, that's as someone who has a specific background. So my father was a professor, and I grew up in these forts, you know, always going to these forts, always hearing these stories from a very young age. And so I think the concept black is an attempt at gathering the pieces after something very painful was broken. And I didn't know that I was black until I came here and became one of the black girls, you know, and I was very happy until I also realized the insult that comes with that black. You know, I was very happy to be united in this society. But there is a question that is not related to this comment. The question is, you were saying you met your partner as equal, and that worked for you. But in society, people might have certain stereotypical ideas about you, which you mentioned, right? Yeah. So how do you deal with that? Because there's you and your choices, and you as a unit, and then there's this unit that is actually being chiseled at by a society that cannot understand you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we keep returning to this point because it must be so crucial and true. I think you are limited by where you are and who you're around, and you're not fully an agent, only defining yourself and acting. But part of what I was doing in the book, and whenever I think about my father, is taking seriously the fact that we both are Americans, but he grew up in a different country than me, and that societies evolve and change, and I live in a space of greater freedom, though I don't think I have absolute freedom. And I have been affected in certain ways. My brother was beaten, by police officers. I think it was racially inflected. Other things have happened that show me that it's not the same at all as it had been, and so I remain aware of the caution some of you are drawing to some of the arguments I'm making to acknowledge that there are limitations. But ultimately, I guess I'm optimistic because I know how much is so different generationally. And when I look at the difference between my father and where my kids are and the world they grew up in and what they take for granted, while recognizing that colorism is real and all of these things, I still am left, even with all the backlash and racism on the rise, I'm left with a lot of hope that things are getting better and improving.
Thanks. Also comments from you from what Ama was saying?
Well, actually, to go back to the contribution there, your remark, yeah, I sound like a broken record, but yeah, it is a process, and I feel like I'm doing both. Like I'm definitely getting more comfortable with calling myself a Nigerian and culturally being more in connection with my roots, and less worried about the loss of my father as this cultural barometer. Like he was my Nigerianness, and I felt this responsibility as to what I'm going to be able to pass on, but also this having or coming to a kind of understanding that maybe I was ashamed of the color of my skin. That's very deep. So now that I'm able to kind of feel seen and call myself a black man, that I think I'm going to need to be able to keep doing that for a while. I think so. So I think for me it's both.
Yeah, what I wanted to add, like as Ama was pointing out, that of course these concepts of black and white are contextual, because you can be white in one country and black in another. And what I felt was freeing about reading your book was also some of the experiences I had as a white person in the anti-racism movement, that sometimes there are stereotypes about white people as well, like white guilt, not really stereotypes, but like analysis, like white guilt or white innocence, and then sometimes you would be having
the stereotypes are more like taking a lot of space,
and
or
not washing well enough.
Really.
Well, there was a debate about washing your legs, and then there was like, white people don't wash their legs, but I don't know. There's a lot of, and then at a certain point, like, me and Ama have had lots of discussions about it, like traveling around Ghana and me doing things, and then like, is that a white thing or is that just my character? You know, like, am I just a blunt person, or am I taking up too much space? Like this. So I think it's very good to be critical of those categories, but on the other hand, they're helpful. Like I think the concept of white privilege is helpful for white people to understand that institutional racism is a thing that they don't suffer from. So, yeah.
Well, I also should say, maybe I haven't, I'm primarily writing about America, but I think some conversations in Europe have a different urgency. And I think, in France, where I live and understand the society better than I understand Dutch society, they have never had a discourse of white privilege until quite recently. And so it may be at a different stage of development than it's gotten in America where it's been really exhausted. And and the Netherlands might be, in Europe, you may have different needs for different conversations and discourses. Also, some of the language, a lot of language comes from America, comes from activism and scholarship in America, and it gives people a vocabulary to use for local oppressions and local situations that they have in their European societies. But European societies, even though we're all Western, are not, and we're all derived from Europe, are not exactly equivalent with the society in which these ideological and scholarly tools were developed. So actually, it is important for white people in France to think about some of these things, but the discourse of white privilege and systemic racism must be different there than it is in the society it originated from, because they are a post-colonial power as Holland is, and not a slave state with slavery within its own borders. These nuances matter, but we have these kind of blunt terms that everybody uses, and so I think that sometimes causes some of the backlash in Europe as well, because there's a sense that we're not America, and I don't want to think about, it can be hard to reach French people sometimes with American vocabulary, but I understand why minorities there felt they finally had the words to describe things that they were feeling that they didn't have a native vocabulary for.
Okay, there's so much to talk about, but we always have a third round at the bar, so let's do that. And you can read the book if you want to have more information. You can watch the Afro-European that's now airing at the NPO Start. Or
really great. Congratulations.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful documentary. Wit is ook een kleur, Our Colonial Hangover. So let's keep this conversation going. And thank you for being here, and thank you for watching.
Thank you.